Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 53 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back with Curt and Jerry today for our first episode of year 2. Congratulations, fellas. It was so cool to hang out with you all last week in person for our first 3 people in a room episode. So I hope our listeners enjoyed that. Just a shout out too. I was in Nashville and I had a few people come up and said, you know what? I didn't know. I listened to the podcast. I didn't know it was you. And it's like, it's kind of like this little celebrity thing. It's like, we're kind of famous. Again, it's one person out of a room of 100, but still a little cool. I just got to say, guys, it's, you know, people coming up with the stars in their eyes, and then they meet me and they're all disappointed. But hey, at least I'm tall, so it helps. But welcome, Curt and Jerry. Today we're going to talk about a topic I've been ruminating about. I've been really, it's been in our quell for a while. And I've been, if you know me, you know I think a lot in analogies. And I want to present one as a way to potentially look at wellness and then hopefully spur a good conversation about something I think is incredibly often overlooked and potentially to the point where it might do harm, though I want to kind of lay off that to see if my point goes anywhere with these 2 fine gentlemen. So, as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And Curt, I wonder if you want to start us out this week.
I thought about this actually a lot, how much I enjoyed sitting and talking with all of us together. It's been a little while since we've all been together, and while we get to see each other every week on doing the podcast over video, it's not the same. Yeah. So that's my bright shiny object for this week is last week. I got to sit down with the 2 of you and have a great time just talking. We recorded an episode and then had a chance to go out and just sit and talk and kind of connect personally, and that was a real highlight of my week last week. So I want to thank you both for coming all the way over to my office for that and for spending a little extra time while we just got to connect and talk. And it reminded me how much I enjoy the both of you. So thank you.
Thanks, Curt. Jerry, what are you thinking about this week?
You know, I've been thinking about how difficult it is in today's healthcare industry and health providers, how difficult it is to be an administrator and hold an organization's survival at stake is always with funding and other types of things, but also staff's emotional states. I think it's really in a way both an incredibly difficult job to stay present, to stay attentive, to stay attuned and responsive to the staff while you're dealing with so many difficult challenges. So I know that we always talk a lot about the providers of these services, but the people running these organizations, it is a really difficult job. So I want to kind of recognize this week people running organizations. We talked about homeless organizations, or we talk about residential treatments, or we talk about community-based projects. But really the wear and tear on their nervous systems to both be able to be present in the moment, but to have an eye towards the future and what's coming towards the organization, really it has something to be recognized. So my hat goes off to them. The other thing I want to say is Matt's a lot more comfortable with his being famous. I would rather be in the background not being so famous. So if you see me and you know me, don't come up and
Don't talk to me. You're the diva, Jerry. You're the diva.
All all Curt and Matt.
Jerry's just in it for the art. There's no recognition, no ego. He's just in it for the art. So don't talk to him.
That's right. I'm a shy
He buy his album, but he doesn't really want you to talk to him ever. So, well, great. So we learned that about Jerry this morning. So I'll throw one out there too. I just read the book, The Deepest Well, by Dr. Burke Harris. I think that's her last name. Dr. Harris might be the only one. Really great working with children in a really impoverished part of San Francisco, and really a good book. If you've read a lot of trauma books, it doesn't give a ton of new information, but she's a great storyteller. And if you're looking for a good book on trauma, especially if you're new to the topic, very entertaining read, very educational read, talks a lot about ACEs, and she is, as Jerry mentioned, a medical doctor as well. So from that unique perspective in her work. So just another great book out there. If someone, a new friend in Colorado Springs recommended it to me, and I jumped right on Audible and used my last credit, and I just finished it. I have 0 credits now, so I don't know what to do. I'm going back to my library and list some old ones because I am very cheap. So, all right, let's get into this subject. So this is the analogy, and Jerry's been with me on a journey of a few of these. I think he was when at first I presented the cup analogy, and then I nerded out about that for about 5 years, and now I think I can explain everything through the cup analogy. But this one was kind of new, and it was based on a book I was reading, Why Isn't My Brain Working? I think I mentioned this a little earlier by Dr. Kazrian, and I know I'm mispronouncing that one. So Why My Brain Isn't Working is the book. And really takes a deep dive into looking at a lot of psychological and you know, to say psychological, medical, physical, and pull those two apart is sort of hard, especially when we talk about the brain. And so he was looking at a lot of nutritional stuff and wellness deficits or habits that could lead to a lot of mental illness symptoms, as well as physical symptoms. And again, we are learning that all those are connected in an interesting way. And as I was reading the book, one thing's been striking me for a long time, but it just really drove it home is, especially early in my career, I worked in a lot of residential facilities. And one of the things that always struck me odd, even before I've taken these deep dives in the literature, is you know, we used to feed these kids terrible stuff. I'll never forget it. It's almost like it's this image that sticks in my head is 200 corn dogs on one cooking sheet. And because our ovens were from like the 1940s at this facility, there was like one perfect corn dog and everything else was either burnt or still frozen. And I just look back at how we even fed some of our kids. And then my work in with autistic kids really, one of the things we were doing at the school I was helping to run at the time was we were giving milk to everybody. And then saw some research come out that correlated dairy with behavioral problems with kids experiencing autism. And we realized that we were trying to do something good, but potentially being counterproductive through our trying to give someone healthy. And it really spurred in me, and we actually saw some behavioral improvements when we stopped giving milk. And so the analogy that I'm working on, and just to put the preference out, if I'm not talking for all of us, you guys can definitely jump in here and put your own voice to this, but none of us are medical doctors. So if I say this is something I take because I've done a lot of research on it anywhere in this episode, that doesn't mean it's medical advice. Also, I think when I say the next analogy, I know I'm not anti-psychotropic medication by any stretch. I've seen psychotropic medications be so central to many people's healing process. But when I was reading some of this book and a couple other books I've been reading lately, I started to think about wellness because basically for so much of my career, I might refer if they weren't in-house or have a psychiatrist in-house, meet with the kids I was working with, and most kids walked out of that meeting with the psychiatrist with a medication to take. And again, that's kind of why we sent them to the psychiatrist. So nothing, not speaking bad about any profession here. But also when you look at wellness as such, in some ways, again, our economies of healthcare are so odd, but feeding a kid a healthy salad versus a corn dog can have huge impacts on biological and neurobiological functioning. Cheap supplements. One of my favorite right now is a supplement called Dha Fish Oil, which is really being shown from everything that I've seen to really promote healthy prefrontal cortex functioning with zero side effects. And you can get it in vegan form too, which makes me very happy. And I started to think about this as wellness because it's relatively cheap in most situations. And again, it's just almost tweaking some of the things we do. I kind of came up with this, and then I'll throw it out to you guys to see what you think about my new analogy. But it seems like wellness should be seen as diplomacy. Like, we really want to do everything we can through diet, through, even like, I can't remember giving one of the kids in treatment even a multivitamin, like that simple of thing. But all these very cheap, again, relatively speaking, interventions, and thinking of wellness as diplomacy. And then when we jump up to something with the side effects and cost of psychotropic medications, well, that's kind of war, so to speak. So you really, in my mind, as I go through all this reading and all this science, it's like most countries will want to like really look at diplomacy first and try to do all the options that we can. And sometimes you might have to go to war, and don't get all ethical on me on here. I'm pretty much a pacifist as they get. But sometimes you have to do that if the issue isn't resolved other ways. And I just kind of want to see what you guys think about that. It really helps my thinking of why aren't we exploring the cheap, potentially life-changing events, because probably a lot of our kids are sent in those residential treatments with food allergies that we never diagnosed, and we may be putting stuff in their body that we now have good proof could be really impacting their mental, physical, and neurobiological health. So I don't know who wants to take this on first, but love to get your guys' thoughts on this. And again, the topic of wellness in general.
I think we're going to have to retitle the episode From Corn Dogs to Diplomacy.
It's done. It's being made right now.
You get a glimpse into how quickly your mind can travel, Matt.
Yes.
I think I'll throw out two things. One is having been in positions to make decisions that actually would relate to some of the things that you're saying. I think Jerry's point from earlier is kind of resonating with me of how difficult it is to be an administrator in these facilities where this happens, right? That you're working with incredibly challenging budgets and trying to do the very best that you can. Not that we shouldn't always push ourselves to do better. I firmly believe that we should, and that we should always be questioning what are we doing and is this working, and have a healthy kind of sense of pushing ourselves to improve, especially the way that we treat children. I think that's something to be worthy of being passionate about, I believe. So that's one thing I think, and I have seen some real success in that area with having dietitians on staff who have done a really wonderful job of nutritional assessments and making sure that even though they're working with a very challenging budget, and they find a way to do it. And I've seen it done very, very well. So that's kind of a hopeful message. I hope that it can be done, and I've seen it done. I've seen it done well. The other thing that I think is about, I think, Matt, this is kind of one of your central questions, is how do we think about and how do we define wellness? How do we actually define that problem? And there are lots of different kind of ways to do it with different measures. I think that we could talk a little bit about. There are measures of physical health. There are measures of biological function that we could use for wellness. I think one of the more interesting ones is measuring happiness.
Yeah.
Some interesting kind of measures about thinking about measures of happiness or contentedness. In some of the literature that I've read and reviewed on happiness, there are a couple of interesting ways to measure it, and they're very different. And one way is a retrospective way, which is asking someone later, were you happy previously? And another way is to take repeated measures of, how do you feel right now? And whether or not you're repeatedly rating yourself as happy in any given moment. And I think those are really interesting and different measures as we think about kind of wellness and like, where are we at this point in time? And do you have lots of measures at multiple different points in time that correlate with one another? Or do we ask retrospectively, were you well at another time? Or how did you feel at a different time? So those are just some kind of free thoughts that popped into my head while you were talking. Jerry, too, I know in a lot of the discussions that I know you and I have had about how do we think about different perspectives from adults as caregivers to children. And that very always, I think, we think very, very differently as adults than we did as children. At least, hopefully, we have changed some. And some of those, if I'm remembering some of the conversations we had, we talked about how for adults, it's a challenge for us to live in the moment and not worry about the future all the time. And for kids, we're always trying to get them to think about the future and not live in the moment so much. So that was some of the ideas that I remember some of our discussions about. Those are some of my thoughts initially. That's maybe a little tangential to what you were talking about, Matt, but I certainly think that it can be done well, but it takes some effort.
Jerry, what are some of your thoughts? I know you've had experiences similar to ours with residential care. Having supervising that kitchen budget is always a fun thing. So I just kind of wonder some of your thoughts on this as well.
Well, I think you're raising important points, not just in terms of the care of people with mental illness, but as a society as a whole. The balance between what's good for us versus what we can afford and what we're willing to subsidize in some form of fashion is a cultural issue, right? To kind of looking at some of those. So as we kind of address this issue, we can't separate it from the larger culture that struggles with the same types of issues to kind of manage some of that. But I also think that having a trauma-informed perspective allows you to look at this issue from a different lens, as opposed to a psychiatric problem that's one is contained within an individual, that something is wrong with that individual, and that the way that you treat that individual is, one, by managing their behavior, and two, is by giving them some type of chemical that's going to manage their behavior, right? And I think that has been the more medical model of how do we manage these symptoms, right? To kind of look at that. And you're raising a really important question in terms of what's driving those symptoms, right? So in terms of, is there food allergies? What is the relational environment around them? Do we expose them to nature with adequate, right? There's all sorts of ways in which we can be thinking about creating wellness, right? We know that as a species, being relationally connected helps us to regulate our bodies. We know that what we eat and ingest helps us regulate our bodies. We know the context in which we're surrounded by, whether we're in crowded, congested kind of environments versus natural kind of environments. So all the things that you're raising you have to have a particular lens to kind of incorporate them into your possible solutions to problems. Mm-hmm. So I think that really when we seek in some ways government dollars to solve these problems, the government has a particular lens that they apply that. And so I can afford to buy corn dogs because it's my minimum requirements to kind of look at it, right? So I think that as we change the lens in which we kind of define the problems that we're treating, that we define the problems that we're trying to, in some ways, help the person instead of heal them, but provide them with some experiences that allows their bodies to naturally heal themselves. Mm-hmm. Right? Kind of look at that as opposed to you come to me and I give you something and I'm healing you. How can I create an environment with certain nutrition, with certain experiences, with certain relational interactions that is going to optimize your own body's ability to move towards health? It's a very different lens. So if you think about diplomacy versus war, you already had a bias there. Mm-hmm. You came with a lens that diplomacy is a better solution. I agree with you, but we have to understand that that's a lens. That some people are going to see that if I don't use power and control to get you to do what we want, we're never going to get, right? We live in a world to do it. So we've got to understand what's the lens that people are looking through and then help them shift that lens, which I think hopefully our podcasts do all the time. And then when their lens shifts, they can incorporate some of these solutions into their ways in which they address the problems.
Yeah.
Matt, I got a question for you to kind of think through. So as I'm listening to what Jerry said, and you're bringing up, some other points that we may want to be considering as we get more information or more insights into how, let's say for this one, right? Say how the gut-brain connection has been, that's been talked about a lot recently in a lot of the media. As we get new information, how do you balance the struggle of everything shifts now, right? So there's one more thing we got to pay attention to, and there's always one more thing we've got to pay attention to. And I think that can be a challenge for treating professionals. And I would imagine a significant challenge. I'm thinking back on, and when I was a younger clinician, kind of like everybody runs over to the new watering hole and we all gather around there until somebody finds another one. We run over there. And so you just kind of do this hopping from one important thing to the next important thing without having a way of deciding what's important and what can be less important, how to prioritize things. Some thoughts you have about that, and how do we help people with that, and how do we think about prioritizing?
That's a great question. And really where I start, because I think you're absolutely right. And as someone who tries to get as much things without kind of chasing them until I've got enough proof that it's worth kind of chasing. That's kind of how if I just read it in one book, I might try it myself because, buying something for $13 on Amazon, hey, let's throw it. I'm at 5 HTP. I'm taking a supplement. Don't think it's really working right now. Probably not dosing at the high enough level, but this is what I'm willing to afford to try it out, right? 1 month, it's not on the subscribe and save yet. But think about, this is what really gets me, the freaking basics. Like when teaching self-care really pushes me into this area in a very powerful way where I see it as really a central part of my work. But I think if I asked like 90% of the people, okay, where would be to improve your wellness? And I'm talking about professional people, so people with a job, with some resources, usually stable housing, is where do you focus to improve your mental, emotional, psychological, social health? Well, the foundational things is good sleep, exercise, and diet. I try to put mindfulness as the number 4 one right there because of all the research. But I mean, if we just start there, and I think about, you know, when I have kids in a residential facility, it's a very powerful example because I, in some way, and limit different in different ways. I never supervised kitchen staff, but we had control of what we fed them. And I don't think we did sometimes in certain places I worked a very good job of thinking through that. I think, you know, you go to my wife's school in Boulder, Colorado, where they get grants from farm to table, and you've got one of the healthiest salad bars you could possibly feed kids. It's not that god-awful pizza that I ate in elementary school. So, you know, but when you shift out of that and you think about individuals experiencing homelessness or other really high acuity issues, do they have access to healthy food? Or is putting McDonald's in their body every day? Nothing against McDonald's. There's things against McDonald's, but you know, throwing Big Macs down your throat because you're lucky enough to have gotten a few dollars is not a way to get out of homelessness. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you're sustaining your brain on Big Macs, it's not going to promote the kind of neurobiological healing that we want. Sleep, another thing. If I had to either sleep in a shelter or sleep outside and never knowing if I was safe. So when's the last time some of these folks have gotten good REM sleep? And then exercise is almost a joke. We know that, again, I'm not a medical professional, but the research shows that, you know, 35 to 40 minutes, 5 to 6 days a week of vigorous exercise lowers depression symptoms as much as psychotropic medications do. Yet, you know, we're going, how many people of us thought about giving a gym membership or helping people find a way to exercise before dropping the pills on them? So I don't know. I mean, to me, we've got so much to do with the big three, so to speak, that, yeah, I would love to at least give everybody a multivitamin, because multivitamins aren't the solution, but at least, hey, you've got enough vitamin B12 and 6 to maintain functioning. So I guess that would be my answer to the question. Is I think so much of this is before we do the food allergies. Are you gluten sensitive? Do you have leaky gut? Is like, oh my God. Like, sure, if you're eating Burger King or Big Macs or Wendy's, you probably got leaky gut because of all the crap that you're putting in your body on a daily basis. So I think we got so much work to do on the basics before we even kind of get, I think, to some of those DHT, 5-HTP kind of supplement sort of levels.
I think, too, Jerry, I think you have an interesting perspective that you could share on this issue. Is one, you're a very recognized expert in trauma, especially in trauma treatment for children.
Not a celebrity, though.
Don't tell anybody that, because then they'll pay attention to me.
Well, it's out now.
It's all about the art, Curt. It's all about the art.
I can't even ask a question. But two, you've been in, I think, a very unique position as the leader of an organization, where that's where the work that you did. And you had to make those decisions about priorities with kind of the added, I would imagine, added weight on there of, but I'm an expert in this. Like, I should do this well. How did you do that? And what was your process for making those kinds of decisions?
You know, my process, well, you know, you have to ask my staff if I did it well, right? So it's kind of, well is a relative term. So, but I could share with you my process to kind of look at that. Is that there was a funding source that was very restrictive to tell me exactly what I needed to do and how I needed to do it, right? So whether that was the counties giving me dollars or Medicaid giving me dollars, it really was very clearly, pretty well defined. So I had to kind of create a structure from that. But then I had philanthropic dollars. And so through those philanthropic dollars, I could in some ways, look at my organization and think, how am I going to utilize those philanthropic dollars to achieve what I think helps the clients in the way that I believe, right? So there's a frame of reference. So I've talked about this along, that the mission of the place that I was working at was to create a safe environment for children and families to heal and grow. So I had to go back and say, what did that really mean? And we can't really achieve all of that within the confines of these dollars I'm getting from the state, the federal government. What we could do with the dollars we get from philanthropic donations is to help the people giving money understand why there's other needs we have that are outside what we have. So I would get money to create an art therapy program. I would get money for our yoga program. I would get money for our music therapy program. I would get money for looking at taking our kids and doing certain activities with them to kind of looking at that. We formed a relationship with the university that did culinary education, and they came over and did some food with the children, both in our residential, but in our group home, to teach them how to utilize low budgets but cook healthy foods, to kind of looking at some of those. So those are things you do outside of your traditional funding sources, which is really a shame, because really we know those are really important. And over time, I could eventually, with research, I could actually begin to hire therapists who did yoga and actually bill Medicaid for yoga, but call it stress management, and kind of look, right, to kind of manage it. So we often have to push the system for the things that we know are the good things for our children and families or our clients outside our traditional funding sources, to kind of look at it, because we know both in our own lives that they're helpful, but also the research is beginning to tell us, but the system hasn't adapted those kind of models yet. And so I think that that's how I tended to manage this dilemma, because we talk about dilemmas all the time, between managing a budget and providing what I think is the right thing for children and families to kind of have access to the kind of. Mm-hmm. So for example, we might get, raised dollars, and I would send some of the moms to a spa day. We would send them to a spa. We'd go out to some salons out in the community and ask them to donate some time or to kind of do it, so that, really stressed out families could actually get some time alone to take care of themselves, because we believe that that was trauma informed. Now, could I go to the county and could I go to Medicaid and say, can you pay for this mom to go get her hair done and have a day of getting her nails done and doing it, because it's really important for her to lower her stress level so she could be, no. So that's where the community dollars help us to effectively make the kind of changes we need those things get more difficult as the crisis in your organization funding, right? So when funding is adequate, I can think strategically to look at it. When funding crises come, I'm just trying to kind of make ends meet, to kind of manage some of that. So I think as our models change, we need to both be thinking about how we can actually fund the right things for our clients, but we also need to be advocating in the system to change the current system, so eventually you get some alignment between what we know works and what we, Dr. Kemp, who did the battered child syndrome, always said is clinicians always have to be way ahead of science. We have to kind of be doing things that science hasn't yet proved, but there's enough evidence that it could be effective to help our clients. And when we do it with enough frequency, then we could then prove it and then get people to pay for it to kind of do it. So you're always pushing the system a little ahead. And I think Matt's point about trying to get nutrition involved to do it is there's a challenge between what the budgets tell us and how we actually access, but it's not an undoable task.
Right. Yeah. And it's, you know, and again, as Jerry, those budgets, we exist in weird markets because it's probably in some ways more affordable to give somebody a very expensive psychotropic medication than it is to feed them a salad every day, which I think is.
But one is seen from a medical model as an intervention, and one is not. So
yes.
Again, you're 100% correct. But at what lens are you looking at the problem, and how do you solve it? So
yeah,
the problem we always have is as our knowledge and science changes, the habits of our funding systems. You know, an example of that is a really good example is that we know that our diagnostic classification model is really not very valid. It's very reliable. People can do it they can look at symptoms and can do it, but it's really not valid to think that just because you're in this category that everybody who has a depression is the same and everybody is, right? It's not. So, but our whole medical field has been built around this diagnosis. So to change it is going to it's going to take significant amount of time and effort and energy to change that system. So we know that it doesn't work. We currently are working on new ways to think about this problem. And it's going to take us 10 to 15 years before we actually change the problem, right?
Yeah.
And so we've changed our lens in which we look at some of these issues, both knowing that it doesn't exist just within a child or in a young adult, but it's involved in the relational environment that they're living in. But we don't think about the diagnostic system that considers all those things.
Right, and I think your quote, I believe, was Dr. Kip about clinicians need to be ahead of science.
Right.
I think what I'm trying to say is I'm amazed, and there are some. So this is not a blanket statement. I'm talking about more of a societal thing about how far, in some ways, medical care is behind science in this point. It's like, you know, before you prescribe something that could potentially do some harm, why aren't you ruling out some basic even food allergies?
Why do you think so? Why do you think that is, Matt?
I think, well, one, I think medical care is somewhat behind the science, and there is a huge financial benefit to staying in the current model. It's cheaper for many people to give a very expensive pill than to do a food allergy test that might reveal something like, and I know the gluten thing is a trigger for people, especially here in Colorado, because you can't find anything with gluten in it anymore. But like, if you seriously have a gluten allergy, that could be responsible for so many of the symptoms that you're now medicating. I see this as very similar, as we know that trauma is often misdiagnosed. For the one that always sticks with me with school is for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we're medicating the symptoms while we miss an opportunity to really get down to the cause of those symptoms. And I see this as being very similar, as we could be giving a pill that actually, one of the best books I read on looking at psychotropic medication is they compared it, giving a psychotropic medication to carpet bombing. Now, you're probably going to hit the area of the brain you want to hit, but you're going to hit a lot of other areas as well. And giving that to a developing brain could have a very negative impact to that brain if we're not, if we're medicating something that's not truly the core of the problem. So I think we're stuck in this model, and we're so in it that we'll prescribe a neurobiologically changing medication after a very short visit to a psychiatrist while we miss a lot of the basic stuff. And so, Curt, I would love to get your opinion, because every time I read a book, I think, what would Curt think about this? So let's say from a behavioral context, and we've done a lot of work, I know, in similar populations, and I think autism is in some ways, still behavioral driven way of thinking about behaviors and education and those sort of things. But let's just keep with the gluten thing, and listeners, you can yell at me in the comment section. I'd love to hear it. But let's say you've got a kid with that potentially is a lot of the behaviors. Now, I'm not saying gluten sensitivity causes autism by any stretch, but maybe a lot of the behaviors are potentially caused not by environmental impacts, but the fact that we're feeding this individual food, like the milk studies that I saw come out when I was doing it. How do you think about this from that behavioral perspective? Is things that the kid might be putting in their body thinking it's healthy, like we gave people milk, thinking we were doing a good thing, was actually created behaviors that were counterproductive to our outcomes?
Well, I think addressing the question of, do dietary changes show a direct cause to a behavioral symptom, is a really tenuous question. That is a very difficult one to say, this causes that. Those two things are really difficult to parse out. They're often not connected in time. So that's really challenging.
Can I throw one? Let me get maybe a little bit more. So certain food allergies create inflammation, including inflammation of the brain, which
can happen, right?
Okay.
Then you've got an intermediary variable.
Ooh, tell me about that.
Right, so then you have something that's intervening between your physical event, which would be the ingestion of some food, and the output, which is some change in behavior.
Okay.
Right now you have an intervening variable. And so it's very difficult to show cause when you have intervening variables. And so that's a challenge in saying, and I think, go back to your point about being ahead of science. There's a risk associated with being ahead of science as well. We can still hear people talk about vaccines causing autism, right? They don't. We've shown that it took 15, 20 years for science to correct itself from the original study that said, I have evidence now that vaccines cause autism, and we find out that that guy falsified his data. But it took 15 years to even find it out. And now still, this many years later, we're still trying to untangle that mess of science that really wasn't science. So I think I would give a word of caution about getting too far ahead of science, in that we can often, and this has been an issue in the field of autism for a long, long time. There are lots of fad treatments in autism, and they are really can be very, very dangerous. So changing, I've treated a lot of families who have completely revamped diets in some really weird ways. And anecdotally, they tie it to some symptom improvement, but it's only anecdotally. There is no real science behind it. And those things can be actually somewhat dangerous. So I think that there are some things that we need to consider there as well, in terms of making some of these changes and then saying, well, this caused this or this caused that. That can be somewhat challenging to parse out. Not to say that, we shouldn't take some of the things that we know from science about how the brain develops or how the gut-brain relationship works, and we can make some good decisions with that. But we also have to be careful that we don't do things that we're just following every fad and changing every diet and being like, all right, we're not eating broccoli anymore because broccoli does this. That can be somewhat dangerous.
Yeah, and eat broccoli.
Broccoli's good.
Yes, good example. Jerry, because I guess I'm also very, very fascinated in my nerdy way with the inflammation piece and the fact that there are, I'm not a medical professional, so don't stick anything in your body without looking it up yourself. But there's some really good, I think it's turmeric out there. There's some different very cheap supplements that can help inflammation, and even hearing Curt talk, it's like, should our interventions be built upon a better understanding of our biological functioning? So should we get a more baseline medical information on folks before we start sticking psychotropic medications in their system?
Well, we should do a lot of things rather than just stick medications in their systems, right? Is that we know exposure to pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activities, rewarding activities, helps individuals regulate their nervous systems, and that engaging in certain things like yoga and other kinds of things have, as good as long-term impacts as medication does without the negative side effects. So, I think that yes, we should be doing all of those things. But I want to caution, just as Curt just said, is kind of not jumping too fast, because there are people who are having incredibly good diets who struggle with mental illness. Mm-hmm. And there are people who have been exposed to childhood adversity who have significant structural changes in their brain, who are functioning very well, and have inflammation. And is that we tend to want to kind of create a cause and effect as opposed to a correlational connection to these things. And so what we know is that maltreatment early in life creates a change to the nervous system that creates changes to the brain structures that can change to do it. But it doesn't necessarily account for why people end up getting a depression or getting psychotic or getting, right? So there's not a one-to-one relationship in there. So that it would be very nice, Matt, if it was this simple to say, all we need to do is not give corn dogs to the kids and they would get better. Right?
Yeah.
I think that that's a really important thing. Does that mean we shouldn't improve their food to rule out and create it because it's healthy to do it? Yes, we should. Does that mean we shouldn't bring in exercise programs? Yes, we should. But doing that is not necessarily going to reduce the need necessarily for some people to have medications. And doing that is not necessarily going to be sufficient enough to address all the problems that we're facing. So I think that going back to Curt's original question back is, how do we kind of prioritize these issues? And how do we not run from this well to this well to this well going back, knowing that we don't really know what the relationship between all these things are. Right. So maybe if you have good diet, you have good exercise, and then you have good relational connectedness, it leads to health and wellness. Maybe if you have good diet, but you don't exercise, but you have good relational, still could live. I mean, I don't really understand the relation, and we're not dealing in some ways with healthy biological systems that we then apply all these things to. We end up having people come in who have dysregulated nervous systems, who have inflammation, who have poor relational connections, who have poor living conditions, right? So when we're trying to address these problems in some hierarchical manner, how do we begin to kind of look at all of these variables to kind of manage some of those? So I think really everybody should have access to healthy foods. Not just people treating in our systems. Right. Everybody should have access to exercise programs in our school. Everybody should have access to pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activities and relationally rich environments to kind of look at this. If we do that for everybody, then we can begin to say okay, those variables have been accounted for. but we're still getting, how do we then begin to look at some of those kind of conditions to kind of look. So I think as we learn about these things, how do we, in some ways, put them back into our universal interventions? Not just, you're having this disorder, so I'm going to do these. We all should bring those things in. So if it's good for us and good for my child and good for my family, it should be good for the people we're treating, right? It's good. Yeah. We shouldn't say, oh, you know what? I'm privileged, so I have access to these things, but you are having a problem, so you don't get these. It's like, no, we all should have access to them. And then, in addition to that, they may need some additional kind of other kinds of things to kind of look at that piece. So I think it's a good issue that you raise, but remember that it's a multifaceted problem that we have to really take multiple, which is why it's nice to have different people on this podcast shared together, but also if people could call in and say, from my perspective, here's another way to kind of look at this problem.
Yeah, and obviously I totally agree with everything you said. And again, I've seen psychotropic medications be incredibly effective in the past as well. I just, it just made me think about some of the times maybe some of the last things we think about should move up in our priority list of things. And I think, Jerry, you mentioned the hierarchy, and when you say hierarchy in our professions, you usually think of Maslow. And I just those basic sort of needs, and thinking about how do we maximize, again, sleep, exercise, diet. I mean, I would also put housing, stable housing as more of a wellness intervention, because we know that, you get somebody stably housed, their medical and mental health improve dramatically. Now, again, that's a more expensive intervention, but we do see the payoffs in that investment.
I went to Telluride and there's a group of people that live in tents outside of Telluride because they can't afford to live in it.
Yeah.
But they're very connected to that community.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that just putting somebody in a house and saying, okay, now you're in a house, but you don't really belong to our community doesn't, right? And so housing is a piece, but really finding a valuable way to belong to the community is another piece of that. Right? So all of these things have to be put together in a way that we begin to understand as basic human needs that go across all of us. And I think what you're really alluding to is, how do we provide some of these things for everybody, so that we don't go and say, we'll give you all these SOCA medications when your basic needs haven't been met yet.
Right.
To kind of looking at some of those. And you're identifying adequate sleep, adequate shelter, adequate food, that healthy foods, really is an important concept to be thinking about, whether it be in treatment or even in schools. Are kids getting the adequate food before we get special educational dollars to kind of go to look, right? So I think that as a culture, we ought to begin to look at what is a right that everybody has in our culture, and what is a privilege, right? So is having some of these things accessible to you a basic right? Yeah. And that's going to lead to lots of different people having different lenses around. The reason you don't have that right is you didn't work hard enough, or you didn't do this, right? It's like you get into all these. And so what does diplomacy look like in that kind of model? It's like, so I think you're raising some really great issues today on the podcast, and it hopefully generates a lot of discussions for people on the other end that come down to basics. Is what should everybody in our communities have access to, right? So you look at the poorest communities; they probably have access to the least amount of good food. Yeah. Right.
Well, and food deserts are something that I think we've woken up to them, but you're absolutely correct.
Right. So I have kind of a model that I've used in a guy who was one of my real mentor in graduate school, a guy named Jim Johnston, taught me about the scientific method. He's written books on it, and you can Google Jim Johnston and find some of his work. He taught me about a scientific investigation principle that I've then applied in the applied world. And what he taught me was there are at least two major kinds of analyses that we do in science. And one is called a component analysis, and one's called a parametric analysis. Right, so a component analysis is what are the effective components that required for an intervention to work? Do I need component A, component B, component C, or is A and C enough? Or is B and C enough? Right, so is it healthy eating? Is it exercise? What are the components that we need? And then the parametric analysis is about how much or how little can be effective. So I've always used that as a way to think about every single case, and then every single organization or every single classroom or every single treatment facility, right? That I'm always looking at what are the components and then how much of each one do we need to do? And I've used that as a model to kind of, I mean, Jerry, you've like, that's kind of what you've said all the way. A theme I was hearing through what you said is there are components that we need, and then there's how much of those do we need? And I've used that kind of, I always think about those words component and parametric because I'm weird like that, I guess. But those words have been something that I've used for a lot of years and guiding me to think through some of these issues.
Great. Well, I know we're running out of time. I would like to see, okay, so let me put the analogy out there again. And I know that there's asterisks, but would you roughly agree with me? That's all. Would you agree with if I said we should prioritize basic wellness as in the analogy diplomacy for interventions like psychotropic medications? We should at least start with wellness before we jump to a more warlike, again, excuse the violence of the analogy, intervention like psychotropic medications with all the side effects. Is it worth me thinking about this further? That would be, I guess, my question. Or do you think there's too many flaws with this analogy to really make it work, Matt? Just drop it and think about another one.
My first thought that came to my mind is, usually when you're using diplomacy, you're trying to solve problems across cultures. And you have to be able to see the problem not only from your own perspective, but from somebody else's perspective. So when we're dealing with one lens to another, from a trauma-informed lens to a medical model lens to from a kind of social justice model, from a traditional political model, we're dealing across lenses. And so diplomacy requires a respect for each of those components to kind of look at, so that we listen deeply to each other, and then not necessarily I take your solution or your solution, but something emerges from both solutions that is better than either one could be individually, right? And so I think what you're talking about today, if we not just say diplomacy, but we really define it and talk about what that is that if we bring this to the table with a respect and understanding of what somebody else is, how do we come to something that integrates all of this into something better than we currently have?
Yeah.
And I think that definition of diplomacy works for me, as opposed to really, let's look at it as a hierarchy, and what you're doing is not as effective as what I'm doing, it kind of, or I should do, is really, in some cases, medication may be the first thing that you need to do. In another one, diet may need to be the first thing to. So how do you come to the table being open to engaging in these discussions to come to something that really is the best solution, that takes in respect all the science, but also the individual needs of the person in front of you, to be able to come to the best possible outcomes that you're looking for. So I kind of caution about, let's just do all this and kind of not before we do this. Really, let's bring all these options to the table, and let's be open to looking at food and diet and to do it, as well as possible biological dysregulation internal. All of those things are very important processes that need to be considered when looking at complex situations.
Great. Curt, final thoughts. What's your kind of final takeaway from my analogy?
In terms of analogies, I think one of the things you need to consider is that and Jerry, I think, said this in the beginning, right? That you come at it as one is good and one is bad. And so setting it up so that taking more of a strategic approach is good as opposed to a tactical approach is bad. That can be a challenging setup when you're using things like medicine as the bad, right? If it's paired with the bad side, I think that's risky. So I would consider that in the analogy, find a way to make them so that one isn't necessarily good and one isn't necessarily bad. They're just different sides of the same coin.
Your analogies would be so boring.
Well, you get the final thought, Ben.
and your point well taken, my friend. You know, what I love and I think why I think in analogies is because they do spur these conversations. You know, an analogy isn't science. You're trying to represent a way of thinking. But I hope our audience really enjoyed this dive. And this is the first time I've kind of even said this one out loud. So I really appreciate the conversation around my thinking. We actually do, but before I kind of wrap it up, we have a big announcement, and I'll let Curt give you all the details on this. So Curt, let people know what we're going to be doing in a few weeks.
Yeah, we're going to be together, all three of us, doing a keynote presentation and a breakout workshop at it's a conference put on by the Colorado Office of Behavioral Health and the Department of Labor and Employment, called Working Towards Recovery. It's the 4th annual IPS conference. It'll be at the Sheraton Denver West in Denver, out in Lakewood, actually, October 30th and 31st. So we'll keep giving more information as we get it. But Matt, Jerry, and I will all be there together, and should be a great time.
Jerry's just there for the art, though. Just there for the art, not for the fame or fortune.
Jerry comes in the back entrance, and then out. So
I have no trouble with fortune, although I never found it. But I'd rather be rich than famous.
And unfortunately, the three of us are outside.
If I have to choose, right? Because how do Bill Murray, I think Bill Murray said that.
Yeah. Well, and if anybody's interested, again, it's sort of centered around employment. It looks like a great lineup. I think we're also doing a workshop as well. We might try to fit in a unofficial live recording of the podcast in there too.
I gotta go.
We're still working on the details. But as always, I want to thank Curt and Jerry for a great show. Thanks for letting me play out this analogy. Next week, I want to introduce a topic of looking at the power of values. I've done, this will shock everybody, a lot of deep thinking on this topic because you see it pop up in motivational interviewing and some of the best practices we're seeing, but it's sometimes something that takes a different kind of conversation. So I want to just see and explore this topic. I also, one of the things that I want us to sort of look at in year 2 about how do we integrate? We talk, I believe most all 53 episodes for the most part have thought about our work and trauma-informed lens. But what if we put that lens on our own life as well and take a deeper dive into some of that too? So that'll kind of set us up for that. So I'm looking forward to a great episode next time. There's another book I'm going to put up on the show notes that you can find, as always, at trauma-informedlens.org. And it's The Way We're Working Isn't Working by Tony Schwartz. He kind of takes this as a little dated now, but I think he does a good job of thinking about this from a self-care perspective as well. So Why My Brain Isn't Working, I'll throw the deepest well on there as well. So if you're looking for links for those, you can find them again at trauma-informedlens.org. And we will see everybody next week for another episode. Thanks so much for listening.